right, everybody. Welcome from folks joining us all over the world for this very, very special Carr Center webinar that is sponsored by our new program, still new, our Global LGBTQI plus Human Rights Program at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Tim McCarthy, and I'm the faculty chair of the program alongside my trusted colleague, Diego Garcia Blum, who is the director of the program, and we're just thrilled today to be hosting one of the great global leaders of our movement and in our community, a fellow Irishman, I'm happy to say, Tiernan Brady. And today's webinar is entitled Winning Change in Unlikely Places, Lessons from Historic Marriage Equality Campaigns. Tiernan Brady is the visionary strategist behind two of the most successful LGBTQ plus equality campaigns, not just in the history of the countries where he's working, but in the history of the world. This is world-changing stuff that we're going to talk about today. Tiernan Brady is the executive director, was the executive director of the Equality Campaign in Australia, and also the political director of Ireland's Yes Equality Campaign. Tiernan played a pivotal role in securing marriage equality victories through groundbreaking public engagement strategies, which he's going to talk about today. And this webinar is open to our broad Carr Center diaspora, and then there will be subsequently four other seminars that will be catered to and customized to our new global LGBTQI plus Changemakers network. So this is the beginning of a 5-session masterclass by a master who is now going to take over the class. So Tiernan, welcome, brother, and I'll pass it over to you. And I just want to alert the folks in attendance that we will pull back around 9:45 and take some questions, and you'll engage with the folks who are assembled virtually. Okay? Over to you, my friend.
Thanks a million, Tim, and thanks everybody for giving me some time today. Honestly, I mean, I think a few things. One, first of all, definitely, put questions into the chat as we go, and we can think about the answers. Whilst every country has its national stereotype, I am Irish and I am no different. I will quite comfortably talk for an hour, potentially without breathing. And I think you probably want to interrupt that. So, please don't feel reluctant to blow me off course or to say, well, have I missed something, or think about an angle, because there's only so much you can cover in an hour to start with about something that we all are so committed on that we could talk for weeks on end about it. Second thing, and this sounds very housekeeping, I'm very conscious that I am Irish and therefore I speak fast. And I'm going to try and be disciplined about that, because a lot of people joining today will be speaking English as a second language. And I have to remind myself of that regularly, because we can just slip into full garble mode. And I never really realized that, actually, because when you're in Ireland, of course, you don't think you speak fast because everybody's speaking at the same tempo and we're trying to fit in as many words and thoughts as possible. And it was when I went to Australia to take the role as director of the campaign down there. I was in Melbourne in the Victorian AIDS Center, and I was giving a talk, and there was a fabulous young man beside me who was doing the Australian Sign Language, and I nearly killed him. So I realized at that point, I probably need to pace myself. But again, that is what chat is for. If I start freewheeling, pull me back. I'm also very conscious for the people who are doing the full masterclass that we'll be doing 4 other lectures, but there'll be a bit of, obviously, overlap in today, just to say that for housekeeping. I think I was going to start somewhere with the title, actually. Because when we thought about winning change in unlikely places, I think one of the important things to remember is everywhere was unlikely. And everywhere started as unlikely. And most places in the world still are unlikely. And so, we can sometimes think that a few places in the world are absolutely fabulous, and therefore that's the inevitable part of the journey. But we know that even the most sophisticated, fabulous, liberal place on earth, if that's what we're looking for in life, but there's certainly the place that treats LGBT people with the most comparative dignity and status and standing as any other place, wherever that place is, it is not perfect. And B, probably somewhere around 50 years ago, it was still the unlikely place. So I think, as we think about how we create change, sometimes, it's important to remind ourselves that even at a time when things go back and forward, depending on where you are in the world, we have won a lot in a very short space of time. And it's really interesting to talk about how and why we think that's true. But we do want to take great hope from that, and that change can happen quickly when you build the right campaign and the right space for people to engage with you and listen. And look, I know if we start with Ireland, I know most people would have thought Ireland may have been one of the most unlikely places in the world to be the first place on earth, first country on earth to pass marriage by a public vote of the people. And all of that is true. Because, of course, sometimes we think of Ireland, we like to think of Ireland as very modern, sophisticated, high tech, highly educated workforce, global players, and part of so many international organizations. All of that is true. But of course, the other side is true as well. We are, a country that has a very strong adherence to faith. We are a country that has a very strong sense of traditional community and traditional values. So you can be both things at once. And I think probably when people think of us, they're more likely to think of programs like Father Ted and Dairy Girls than they are, to think that we would be the first country to pass equal marriage by a public vote. So I think we were unlikely. But I think the other bit to think about on the Irish side, which depending on where you're joining from, hopefully is a hopeful thought, is of course that happened quite quick, because Ireland was a very, very dark place for LGBT people. The country I grew up in, I was still technically a criminal. Well, not technically a criminal right up until I was in university. So decriminalization literally only happened in the mid 1990s. Now, and I think there's something really fascinating and joyful about that, because not alone is that hope that change can happen fast, but because this was a referendum, because it was the voice of the people, then the same people lived through both of those moments of moving from decriminalization to marriage, and the people changed their minds. So if we look back in 1994, when decriminalization happened, there were polls in newspapers, as there would be, about whether people agreed with decriminalization. And of course, because, as is the case in all countries before decriminalization happened, we were so invisible. So they were asking a question about people they didn't know. So the polling company was asking whether being gay should be decriminalized. And at that point, I can still remember one of the great Sunday papers at the time, and almost 70% of Irish people thought that being gay should remain a crime in 1994. Now, what's startling about that is in a referendum 20 years later, almost the mirror opposite number, 63% of people in Ireland voted for equal status and standing for LGBT people, for our relationships and for our dignity. The phenomenal result. But it means that an awful lot of people who used to think I should be in prison, obviously not me personally, well, maybe me personally, it depends whether they met me before, but the people who thought that people like me and many people in the session today should be criminals became the people who voted yes for equality, and in many cases became the people who campaigned for equality. And I think that, in a way, I was trying to think of what are the hopefully useful principles we could give people throughout this talk today. And I thought that was one that really starts the framing. Today's opponent can be tomorrow's advocate. And we don't just think that might be true. We know it's true everywhere that change has happened. Everywhere people change their minds from becoming an opponent of absolutely no way, imagine gay people having children, imagine LGBT people getting married, to being the people who knocked doors and championed equality. So the challenge for us is, how do we allow that journey to happen? And it is our responsibility for it to happen, because I think that perhaps gets me very quickly, falls straight into the second point that I really want people to think about. And I talked about a lot actually in Australia, is that there is no inevitability of progress. And I think sometimes we're victims of our own success on this because we kind of think good things will automatically happen. But of course, good things don't automatically happen. Good things happen when people campaign for them, when people champion them. And it's precisely when we lull ourselves into that false sense of security that change will happen, and I'm sure it will all be fine, that we get ourselves in trouble. And I know some great thinkers in the world talk about the arc of history bending towards progress, but in a way that makes it sound like it happens accidentally. And the opposite is true. The arc of history bends in all sorts of ways. It just depends who's doing the bending at the time. And so our call to action is understanding good things will happen when we make them happen, and that progress is not inevitable. And of course, we can be reminded of that in the current world at any given moment. Um, but the other thing, which is again, I think a thing hopefully to take hope from, is also one of the reasons this is our great weakness as LGBT progress. Because one of the amazing things about LGBT progress is every time we move towards equality, the earth doesn't fall apart, despite everybody telling us that it would, and certainly those who would campaign against it. So decriminalization would be the end of society. LGBT people having children would be a disgrace in the end. Won't someone think of, the unforeseen consequences? Marriage will lead to the end of marriage if it's equal for all people. And so each time that has been disproved very quickly. So you campaign really, really hard as an organization, as groups, as individuals everywhere, and you get over the line on decriminalization. And the wonderful thing, within a couple of weeks, it's almost inconceivable that we would have been criminals. And that great group of people in the middle for whom, they hadn't thought about it a lot, but they worry about all change, can suddenly see there was nothing to fear from that change at all. So it becomes incredibly accepted fast. And in a way, for us as campaigners as well, that's a problem because campaigners think to ourselves that was easy. We instantly forget how hard something was to get over the line. And that can be a real challenge for us because it makes us confuse that with the idea that a change is enduring. So just because something has worked doesn't mean it's enduring. So we get decriminalization. And then if we think to ourselves, oh, it's inconceivable, we could never lose it again. But therefore, we stop bedding it down. We stop keeping the conversation going. And the same for workplace rights, the same for family rights, the same for marriage equality rights. All of them, each time, all that happened in society was society got fairer and better for a group of people. As you say, the day marriage happened in Ireland or in Australia or in France, nobody was less married and nobody was more gay. And of course, that could be a tragedy depending on how you want to think about it, but it is also true. So the world just rolls on and we realize that was fantastic. Our job as people who are thinking about change is to remind ourselves that all of these wins are babies. They are so young. They are so fragile. They need nurturing, they need bedding down, they need great taking care of if they're to endure in what is a very turbulent and volatile and polarized world. And so, as campaigners, I would say that one, don't be victims of our own success. Don't forget how hard it was to get from A to B, and don't take B for granted when we get there. We have to keep campaigning again and again and again because what we're talking about is how do we persuade, as we said at the beginning, how do we persuade today's opponents to be tomorrow's advocates? And even in those huge moments like a referendum, Ireland, Australia almost voted identically, two very, very different countries, but one voted 62% and one voted 63%. Incredibly consistent result. It was fantastic. It was a fantastic result. And everybody talked about landslide and euphoria and the wonderful feeling. But we had to remind ourselves all the time that that still meant the day after that vote, the campaign couldn't be over. Because if 63% of people voted yes, that means roughly 37% of LGBT people walked downstairs into their homes and had breakfast with a family who voted no. A group of people we hadn't got to yet. They walked to work and sat down with a group of colleagues who they'd been with for 10 years who voted no. And it's that great reminder that, our campaigns don't end. like marriage campaigns, legislative campaigns, judicial campaigns, they all have kind of what we think are finish lines, but these are LGBT moments, and LGBT people still need to win again and again and again the day after. So there is no day where we go home. There's no day where we say we're all done. So, and I know they're quite stepping back and kind of looking at the broad idea of where are we on a campaign. But I think it's so important because I think it gets to one of the other things which I wanted to think about and what we thought about in Ireland a lot. And I think it's just so relevant today, which was, well, what kind of an environment do we need to build to win? Because I think campaigners have a harder job now. There's originally, once upon a time, all you had to do was win the argument. That's not enough anymore. You have to win the argument. Yes, of course you do. But now you have to make the space where the argument can happen in a world where spaces don't exist. And you also have to take care of your people. Like, make the case, make the space, and then take care of your people. I was going to say take care of your base, and I realized when I wrote that down, it rhymed, and then I went, no, don't do that. Don't have some slogan that sounds like a slogan. But all three are really important. But the second two are new, and they were real. But I think for campaigners, they're such an important part if we're going to try and navigate a polarized world. Now, I'm going to come back to that. We're going to come back to Ireland to start with. I think when we talked about the Irish campaign first and we knew a referendum was coming, we had to think to ourselves, how do you get a majority to vote for a minority right? It is a real challenge. If we forget about the marriage issue, even if we forget about the LGBT issue, scenarios where the majority vote in a public referendum for any minority right are incredibly rare. Most minority rights are established through judicial rulings or legislative pieces of action. Referendums are incredibly challenging. And I would tell everyone this straight away. Referendums are terrible ways to decide LGBT rights, full stop, or any minority right. But that said, like all minorities, we very rarely get to decide what game we play. And what really matters is how we play the game that's served up to us. So in certain countries, it was going to be done by a referendum no matter what. But we knew, right, we're heading towards a referendum. How do we need to imagine this? How do we need to think about creating this space, for campaigning? And of course, polarization wasn't anything, it wasn't something madly in the future at that point. It was real then too. I mean, the marriage votes sat between multiple elections and referendum moments across the world that were quite very polarized and quite divisive. So it wasn't like it happened 50 years ago in some idyllic time when everybody, had wonderful campaigns and we all held hands no matter what side we were on. That time never existed. This was in the middle of our polarization. So we had to have a think about, well, how do we win? And what are the main triggers for winning? And therefore, what are the main barriers to those triggers? And so here's the wonderful thing. The main trigger for supporting LGBT equality consistently by a mile is when people know somebody who's LGBT. It really is as simple as that. It's almost disappointingly simple. The challenge is, of course, we think about the people who support equality because they believe in philosophy, the philosophy of it, because they're totally wedded to the values. They're all very important people, but we already have them on board. They're not our target. In a campaign, you're trying to work out how do you get the people who are in the middle who aren't there yet, or who maybe are there but could easily be swayed in one way or the other. And here's the wonderful, beautiful thing that follows on from that. LGBT people have this incredible, wonderful habit of just popping up everywhere. No matter who we are, no matter what country, no matter what part of history, no matter what religion, no matter what political perspective, up we pop, there we are, in every family and in almost every community on earth, which means we have the secret weapon in delivering our own victory. If our visibility is our key to our victory, and we potentially can be visible everywhere. The question is, well, now, how do we make the space for all of that to happen when we already have all the skills we need? And then we have to sit back and think to ourselves, well, what's preventing that? And some of these are the exact same things as before. One of the things we noticed very early on was how do we talk to people about our equality? How do I identify that we want to identify a space for having a conversation? All too often we would sit down there now, Granny, and let me explain to you why you're a terrible homophobe. And we would ask our granny to go through this conversation where we're explaining to her why she was a terrible person. And of course, your granny sits there and nods, but then ignores you or has an argument with you, but certainly gets offended by it. I think one of the challenges of campaigning in a polarized world is that our default sometimes can be, why don't I explain to people what their problem is? And of course, in a place where nobody has to listen to you at all, why would I bother listening to this story where somebody's coming in to tell me I'm a terrible person? Granny never sat down after being called a bigot and clutched her pearls and said, well, thank you for telling me how awful I am. I shall now support you for the rest of my life. That's not how Granny thinks. But all too often we were campaigning like that. We wanted to explain to people why they were the problem. And of course, when you're a minority talking to a majority population, people don't have to listen to you at all. So if you're building a message that makes people walk away, turns them off, presents to them a journey they don't want to take, or identifies them as the problem, then they're going to walk away from that. So that was one of the first great barriers that, how do we allow ourselves to talk to people in a way that identifies them as the solution, that allows them to see that this change we're proposing isn't a rejection of themselves, doesn't require a seismic move away from your own existing values. Because again, I think this became the great barrier where we were saying, come with us, reject everything that you wear. Everything that went before is terrible. And again, you can't really sell that to people because we're all proud of where we came from, or most of us are. Even LGBT people who grow up in a country, most of us are proud of the country we came from. Most of us are proud of the family we came from. We're proud of our hometown. So campaigns that try to make us feel embarrassed of who we are just again turned people off. So when we knew, we're going back to this, when we knew what we had to do was create a space where conversation could happen, where we were visible. That space wasn't being made when we were telling people, come in here till I tell you, Granny, why you're a terrible person. And come in here till I tell you why everything about your previous culture is awful too. What we wanted to do is the opposite of that journey and go, actually, the purpose of what we're looking for is inclusion. We want in. We want into our family. We want to be full members of our community. We want to be full members of the society we find ourselves in. So what we're asking is for you to extend this culture towards us, which became a very different conversation, first of all. So trying to identify people not as the problem became the first one. The second one we realized was if we were trying to create space for conversation, polarization had already started to kick in. And we could see that people didn't want to have fights, so they just withdrew from the topic. And the more polarized the world became outside, the angrier the national debate became on any particular topic, the less likelihood your aunt, your brother, your sister, your work colleague would want to talk to you about it because nobody wants to get into something contentious. People withdrew from it. And this is a really interesting challenge, I think, for all minority rights campaigns, full stop, because polarization is bad for minority rights. Because if minority rights, so many of them are based on creating a space where we are seen, creating a space where inclusion is not a what, inclusion is a who. Because of course, when inclusion becomes a who, that's the big moment when people start to go, well, why shouldn't, Chris and Denny and, Diana, why shouldn't all of them be allowed to be full and equal members of society the same as everybody else? Which is an easier conversation to have than a more philosophical framing about minority rights. So in a polarized world, our space for visibility disappears. Our space where we can talk about this vanishes, which is where change happens. The conversations we're going to have with our family members and our work colleagues. So that polarization is absolutely the enemy of this. And that'll go somewhere else in a second. But I mean, even on a family level, we realized that people didn't even want to talk to their aunt about it, their first cousin who was gay about it. So that was the level of fear of broaching this topic. And we were about to head into a referendum campaign in the hope that people would talk to each other. in the hope that we could create, an environment where people wanted to talk to each other. So we had to be incredibly deliberate about going, right, we have to make sure we're the people that are inviting the questions. We're the people that are creating space for our aunt to ask us, that we're proactively thinking about how do we invite people in this world that doesn't want to proactively invite people in automatically. And like I say, this is 9 years ago. I think it's so important now, even compared to 9 years ago. The space where we can have conversations is gone unless we make it ourselves. So what does that look like? And one of the ideas we took was actually, I was watching the television and I was watching BBC Scotland, which is a British television station um, based in Scotland, as you would imagine. And it was before the marriage campaign, but it was about the Scottish independence campaign. Now, again, and I don't care what anyone's opinion on Scottish independence is, it was just a news coverage. And it was a woman who was standing on the street campaigning for independence. But she had made the sign herself out of cardboard. It was basically tied up with string. And she had just written on it, "I'm voting yes, ask me why." And I remember it was about 3 years out, and I thought, what a genius way of creating space. An invitation to come and talk to me in a world where most people think we're uninviting. And I think I probably remembered it at first most because she was wearing a t-shirt. And I think, wearing t-shirt outside in Scotland is an act of great bravery to start with, because, it is not a warm place. But this invitation to talk was the opposite tone and temper of what was going on in the real world. And we stole it, to be honest. So, and since I was watching it on the news, I don't know who the woman was, and I'll probably never meet her. So we're very grateful to her. But we turned it into a whole entire campaign in both Ireland and in Australia around "I'm voting yes, ask me why" local town halls. And it sounds like a nice slogan, but it's something more important. We knew people didn't want to ask us stuff in case they got it wrong. We knew people didn't want to ask us stuff in case they ended up having a fight with someone they cared about. So they were withdrawing from the conversation, which meant we were going to lose. We were the only side that required space for conversation. The other side doesn't require any space for conversation. The other side, the louder the debate, the better that is for them, because there's no visibility of minority rights. So by inviting people in, we allowed people to ask us questions and to hear that we wanted in. We were willing to step up and answer those questions. And that had to be said again, because you're doing it in a world that is sending the opposite messages. Now, the other problem, of course, we also had to allow people to make mistakes. And I think this is something we kind of fundamentally know we have to do, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we kind of expect people to have a conversation with us at some level of expertise. I mean, because we're talking about in a very short space of time, if we think about this. In 2015, when we were campaigning for marriage in Ireland, most people didn't know what LGBT stood for in Ireland. So, and by the way, I'm not sure, everybody does still. That's, but so back then we had to make a conscious decision to talk about gay and lesbian because they were the two words people knew. So, and we're not talking about 150 years ago. So this in short space of time, we've gone from, correctly, we've gone from lesbian and gay to LGB to LGBT to LGBTQ to LGBTQI to LGBTQIA and to LGBTQIA plus. All of these letters are really valuable. All of them, we all see ourselves in one of them. And we shouldn't discount the value of that. We shouldn't discount the idea that we keep learning more about each other, and sometimes that manifests itself as as another letter. The flip side of that is we have to make sure our learning about ourselves doesn't become a barrier to conversation with the people who love us, the people who know us, the people we're trying to talk to. So, because it can become quite impermeable. Because I'd love to ask Auntie Mary whether she's a lesbian, but I don't know. I don't know what letter she is today. She could be an L, a B, a T, a Q, and that in itself could prevent people from doing it because people feared that they would be contradicted for not knowing everything. And of course, this is really bad for us because the goal isn't for people to know all the acronyms. We shouldn't care if anyone knows all the acronyms in the end, because in the end, we're probably going to add another letter anyway at some point, and that's okay. I mean, I'm not against that. I think it's brilliant. I think every time we add a letter, we're learning and growing about who it is we are. But we can't think that that part of the insight of talking to ourselves is in some way not a barrier to talking to everybody else. There was a Canadian organization wrote to me, and they were the national, years ago now, after the Irish campaign, they were the LGBTQQIAASF2S or S squared organization. Now, they were asking about political engagement. And honestly, I gave them a longer answer than this, but my first line was, you have to change your name. You sound like a pension company. You don't sound like people. And if the purpose of our campaign is to become people, you're not hitting it. And I still always remember, because I remember all of them valuable letters: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transvestite, transsexual, queer and questioning, intersex, ally, asexual. The S was for straight, which I thought was hilarious. Sure, why not? Throw everybody in when we're all here. And the F, interestingly, was for fairy, which again, I thought was fascinating because it told us something else very important. Something that one country and culture might think is offensive, another country might think is empowering. There's no one universal language on this. I think if we had F in Ireland, we wouldn't have, there would have been a lot of eyebrows raised. But it's an interesting insight. Again, there is no one size fits all in any campaign. There are principles we can apply about how we engage with each other, but what we do in Canada won't be what we do in Ghana and won't be what we do in Ireland. We have to apply our principles knowing that they'll end up being different. So we talked through our Canadian abbreviation. But my favorite other one, obviously, was there was an Irish politician, and he was a rural politician. So we kind of made the generalization that he was going to be an unlikely yes voter. And of course, because it turns out, we make generalizations about everybody, whether you're conservative, traditional, liberal, libertarian, environmentalist, we all make generalizations about people. We were wrong in our generalization. He was a brilliant advocate for marriage equality, but he didn't get any of the language right because he just wasn't his area of expertise. So he was campaigning on local radio and in the local village and on his towns and in the local newspapers, but he was campaigning for BLT people. So BLTs, he wanted the BLTs to be treated with equality, and he thought BLTs were great. Now, in reality, he was campaigning for sandwiches for about, a year, talking about all the different things. But he didn't know that. And here's the challenge for us as we think about creating space and allowing people to make error. What's the definition of winning? Is it informing this politician that he's a disgrace because he didn't know the acronym? Or is it empowering the politician and saying, you're absolutely amazing, knowing that when people walk towards us, they grow and learn anyway? That what we can do is set out, the more people engage, the more people know, the more people grow. Our campaigns have to allow that space to happen, because that space, like I say, literally doesn't exist anymore. And so how do we allow people to make mistakes? Because perfection isn't our goal. Our goal is not for them to rock up and become social scientists, or our goal is for them not to become experts in our lives. I don't think I'd like someone to be an expert in my life. It all sounds a little creepy for somebody to become an expert in my life. And the same for all of us. Question though, are we making space for conversation that can happen, where we become visible as human beings, and where people can then learn and grow from that? And of course, it taps into that great bit that, fundamentally, when we make that space, we normally win the argument. We normally can make the case. So creating the space now becomes the new version, that new, incredibly important part of winning the argument. I think winning the argument, the reason I've kind of almost made that a more important point than winning the argument, is the argument will look different everywhere. Because if we're campaigning, never mind Ireland, Ireland's a small island, but how you campaign in a city in Ireland is not how you would campaign on the west coast of Ireland. There'd be two different campaigns. How you campaign in Australia is not how you campaign in Kenya or in Canada. You have to think about how do we allow people to see equality for LGBT people, and we go back to this piece we said earlier, through the lens of the values that they already have, rather than us giving them a campaign that says they must abandon their values and join us. And when we do that, it means for the first thing we're doing is so important for winning, which is listening to people, listening to the people we're trying to persuade. If we, when we were doing the campaign in Ireland, one of the big pieces of research we did wasn't on, what did people think about LGBT people? It was, what did people think about being Irish? What does it mean? So that we could try to understand better who we were talking to, creating space for conversation so we could learn and listen and try and identify what those values were. And of course, those values end up being different everywhere. The reason people get on board is slightly different everywhere. So in Ireland, as an example, if I look at Ireland, Australia, and America, just as three examples of this, I think it's such, there's, you would think potentially on paper, three countries that kind of similar social journeys, maybe. But when we done the marriage campaign in Ireland, we focused on what were these values we wanted to connect to. And of course, they became about Ireland being a republic and equality. And equality became that lens, along with strong community and family. But equality was it. That was the value people could relate to. In Australia, when we done that research, of course, it was about fairness. Australia is famously the land of a fair go. So fairness is this core value. So instantly, we're using two different frames for two different countries. In America, and many people will recognize this, it was about freedom and love. And again, these are really interesting different frames because freedom is such a quintessential American value. Which, and to think about marriage as freedom might seem strange to a lot of us. I mean, we took the American lines in the run up to the Irish election and the Irish vote, and we obviously tested a lot of different lines, but we were testing freedom and love, the American framing in Ireland, and we were, doing focus groups and talking to groups of, heterosexual men who are married, and we would talk to them about, marriage is about love, and they would just laugh at us in the focus group. They were just going, I have no idea what you're talking about. I was in love before I was married, and then what happened? Marriage ruined my love life. So the men just thought this was kind of watching a group of grown men in a focus group start to laugh out loud together when we were talking to them about this frame of love. And then we talked to them about freedom, and they thought we were insane because we were telling them marriage was freedom. Their understanding of marriage was the exact opposite of freedom. And it's not that the American version's wrong, it's that the American version is right for America, and that the Irish framing was right for Ireland, or the Australian framing was right for Australia. And the reason it was right was because we went to the bother of listening to people and going, what are these values that you hold dear? How can we allow you to see our lives through those values? So that the next stage of equality for LGBT people doesn't involve you rejecting yourself at all. It basically involves you affirming that value framework that you already had, and that this is a modern way of thinking about it or a new way to apply it. So I think it becomes that idea of meeting people where they are and understanding that that will be different everywhere. So building campaigns straight out, that are A, relating to people, B, listening to people, C, creating that space for people. I think the other piece then that I think becomes very important, and I know we're trying to condense an awful lot of campaigns into what is, 40 minutes, which is just like impossible. But the pieces that I think we have to remind ourselves more about is how do we take care of our people during our campaigns? Referendums are hard because they're very personal, and it means that almost there's a condensed moment in a national conversation. So LGBT people are finding their lives being spoken about every single hour of the day for a condensed period of maybe 3 months. That's hard. It's hard for a 75-year-old or a 15-year-old to wake up and turn on the radio or turn on their phone and scroll through a whole pile of opinions from people who are talking about their lives. So I think referendums became a very important learning point for us as we campaign for LGBT rights, because it became almost like this laboratory of condensed campaigning experience. And it's not that referendums are the only time that this is hard. In reality, all campaigns are hard for LGBT people. All campaigns involve people talking about us. All campaigns involve people saying the most horrendous things about us. But sometimes that's just elongated over 30 years in a legislative campaign or in a judicial campaign. So perhaps you don't feel it as much as you do as intensely as when you're doing it in a referendum. But that means you get to notice that better in a referendum. You get to think about that experience. And I think, in that polarized world, one of the things we really do need to think about now is how do we campaign in a way that takes care of our people regardless of the result? Because yes, we want to win, but whether we win or we don't, LGBT people will still exist the day after. So we have to build a campaign knowing that actually the finish line is artificial, that the finish line isn't the finish line at all. And it's not like a political campaign. I think sometimes when we think about political campaigns and social change campaigns, we just confuse them. And our brains naturally think about political campaigns all the time when we hear the word campaign. But a political campaign is very different. Bear with me because this is a bit nerdy, I think. Political campaign, the job is to win 50% plus one vote. So you can literally not care about 49.9%. Your job is to just get it over the line because you're going to be in power for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. And the reason we accept that 50% plus one approach is because there's going to be another vote in 4 years' time and we get to throw out the people. So if we don't like what they've done, we get another go. So if you think about it, a healthy political campaign over time is one that has a pendulum. Well, one side wins, the other side wins, 50% plus one each time. That's what a healthy voting system looks like. That's a disastrous voting system for social change. The last thing we want is our existence to be on a pendulum. We want to be embedding and continuing to win all the time. We want to be understanding that the conversation never ends, that if we could win a campaign in a referendum by running a 50% plus one scorched earth political campaign, we absolutely could try and do that. I think it would be probably nearly impossible because we're a minority and we'd be trying to persuade the 90% of people who aren't LGBT to be part of it. But we could try and win that. And even if we won that, the problem with that is we all have to wake up in the same society the following day. That would be the society that we just torched, the society that LGBT people will now have to live in. And the tone that we set is the tone that the most marginalized person we're trying to campaign for will have to live with after we've gone. And I think sometimes we can lose sight of that. And I think the polarization can pull us away from that thought a lot. It's so tempting as campaigners, we can focus on the 5% of the other side and go, right, I want to have a really great radio debate with that person. And it's going to be an absolute scorched earth. I'm going to flatten them in the radio debate. And you think you're winning. The problem is what you're actually doing is it's 5% on your side, but fighting with 5% on the other side, all at a very polarized pitch. And there's 90% of people in the middle who are going, I don't know what this debate's about, but it sounds really ugly. And I think I'll just withdraw from it. And people choose, not to step in. And now we've lost them because we're not creating space anymore. So everything in a way comes back to we are our own secret weapon. We are the story that wins every single hearts and mind. And as individuals, we are the most powerful messenger for that. Because no one is more powerful than you in the circles that you stand in, whether it's your family, your friends, your work colleagues, wherever. So how do we therefore build campaigns that allow us to be the most effective model of that? How do we get stuck into that so that your granny will want to ask you, that your work colleague will want to ask you, that we can have confidence underneath it all because we have the better argument. That I'm convinced of. Our challenge is how do we create a space where the argument can be heard, where we can answer the questions, and really importantly, where we can take care of our people the day after any campaign a day after any campaign ends. And I think as we think through all of those and get guided by that idea of how do we create space, how do we win people over, knowing that almost everybody who voted yes today might have voted no if we'd asked them the same question 20 years earlier. How do you build that journey? So, sorry, and I know there's a few questions, so I'm going to see, I told you, I threatened you, Tim. I knew I'd just keep talking. Sorry.
Right, exactly. And of course, I as a fellow Irishman, I am hardly the person to get you to stop talking because then I'll just start talking. So there are questions, good questions in the chat. So I have some of my own, but I'm going to hold off on them. And if we run out, then I'll ask them. So the first question comes from Henry Wackham, and Henry asks, in this ever-changing world with policies bending with the new administration, how could we walk from the comfort of decriminalization to keep on winning allies? So moving from the sort of win of decriminalization to like continuously winning allies, it goes back to the point that you made about, that we have to keep campaigning, keep, building on the win in a way that doesn't stop. So that's the first question.
I mean, look, regardless of who's in power in any country in any given world, these journeys have to happen. So how do we engage full stop? I mean, our lives endure through governments, first of all. So I would almost, step back from thinking about the political backdrop. Where we have continuously won hearts and minds is in communities. And we shouldn't underestimate that. That is where this is won, because, and I think one of the weird things about the referendum in a polarized world was it actually delivered more victory than we bargained for. Because to win, people in all these towns and villages and crossroads all over Ireland had to do something never done before. They had to go and knock doors and tell their story to their neighbors. And that transformed the country. Like all these places where people who'd been invisible all their lives, and it sucked the polarization out of the space, because now it wasn't some polarized debate on the radio. I mean, it's so easy to remember around polarization. We all blame social media. Great. And of course, social media definitely is partially to blame. It is an algorithm that tries to get the most reaction out of you, and you get more reaction out of anger than you do out of love. Full stop. So the model is based on pulling out your reaction. So unfortunately, it amplifies polarization. But then again, so does the media. Full stop. Because of course, the media wants chat show hosts and opinionists and or columnists and these people to come onto panel shows, and they want someone who will keep people watching. And as much as we'd like to think we're all very learned, our current affairs programs are trying to compete with I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, or My Kitchen Rules, or whatever the program is. And they don't want a polite, dull exchange of views, even though I don't think it's dull. What they want is fireworks. So whether it's any form of media that's trying to hold voters' attention, anger is a commodity. So polarization is pulling at this in all the places where people are engaging with public discourse, apart from the ones that you have the most power to control already, which is your space. How do we have these conversations in our towns? How do we have them in our families? How do we create space for granny to listen? How do we not go to our Thanksgiving dinner for the Americans on the call and go, I can't wait for Thanksgiving because I get to fight with Uncle Joe because he just disagrees with me on everything. That's not the win. The win is, how do we build a space for Uncle Joe to move a little? And it might only be a little. Some of us will never move the full way. There's a great old Irish phrase that Irish diplomacy is the ability to tell a man to go to hell in a way that he looks forward to the trip. And I think conversations, we need to think like that. And we need to think about how every conversation should be a potential moment where we're winning people over. Our single greatest weapon about polarization in this world is what we do every day. And as campaigns collectively, yes, as well, we then have a collective duty to realize we don't just have to win the argument, we have to create the tone where space happens. And of course, that's a new one in polarization. Creating the tone really matters. Because here's the other bit, and it's to your polarization point, and regardless of what administration's in power, one of the reasons the tone of your campaign matters so much is people have very busy lives and they're not really listening to us that much. We like to think everyone hangs on every word that we say. They don't, they're far too busy getting on with their lives. They're worried about their job. They're worried about their kids. They're trying to worry about their future prospects. They could be worried that their dog is sick. All of these things take priority over our policy discussions most of the time. So people are absorbing the messaging around our campaign, the campaign we are building in this polarized world. As I've forgotten who asked the question because it's not on the list. I've forgotten your name, pardon me. But
Henry.
But we're building this campaign in this polarized world where people are kind of just picking up bits of what we're saying.
Yeah.
They're not hanging on our every word. And they're much more likely to remember our tone than our content. So it's a huge mission for us. Sorry, Tim.
No, that's okay. That's okay. In my communications and leadership class, I quote Maya Angelou, who said that people won't remember what you said or how you said it. They'll remember how they felt when you said it.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of questions here. One is from Begonia Martinez, who asks regarding polarization. What do you
Okay.
think of this concept by Alok Vad Menon, blurring lines between us and them? How might we go about that? And then the follow-up was the sort of like conceiving or talking about a we with Granny,
Yeah.
so to speak, or Uncle Joe, or the person who's opposed to us. How do we, is the blurring of that line and the creation of a we from that blurring the way to go?
Oh, you want to just try and get rid of the line.
Mm,
I think it's beyond blurring. I think this is the whole thing. If most people who are on our side now, this is the important part. Most people who are on our side now weren't on our side 10 years ago.
that's right.
So if we had got a tough line, we're we're asking people to cross the line. We're literally, I always think that one of the most important things you can do in a campaign is build your own coalition, not the other sides. The more that we emphasize the line, the more we're identifying people on the other side of it. So we're telling your granny, you're on the other side of this line. So now instantly the journey requires her to cross a line towards us. So, I think there's a real challenge in the polarized world when we say this, but you almost have to think about this that there is no other side. Now, in reality, of course, there is. There are campaigners on the other side, but the campaigners on the other side will be the last people will probably get over the line. Everyone else are busy human beings trying to get on with their lives. And they're the people we're trying to get to talk to. And first of all, as a minority, this might sound so obvious, but I think it's so important. 90% of them aren't LGBT. And we're not campaigning to make them LGBT. This is not a campaign to come and be gay. Let's all be gay. That's not what this is. The campaign is to persuade 90%, a majority of the 90% that we're a good idea that should have equal status and standing. So we can only lose as a population group that represents probably single figure percentages in a polarized world. Any lines hurt us. We
Mm,
need to be talking to everyone as though they could be tomorrow's advocate.
mm,
And I know sometimes that's fanciful because I know that there are people who are never going to budge. But just because they're never going to budge shouldn't mean we never give up on them. And
yeah,
just because the most unlikely people sometimes are the ones that really not just change, but also become drivers of other people changing because now they can see a journey for themselves in this person. You used to say, you know, obviously when I come from Ireland, but one priest saying vote yes was worth 100 saying vote no
mm,
because
mm,
it meant that person who was on the other side of this artificial line was suddenly catching our attention.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I do more than blur it. I think we have to try and think about it as fanciful as this sounds, that everybody has the potential to be tomorrow's advocate. Therefore, making this about one side versus the other is really just in a polarized world is a disaster for a minority.
yeah.
We can't win in that in a polarized world where we're drawing the lines.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm reminded of smiling when you were talking about that because I'm reminded of that famous opening that Harvey Milk would say. He said, "Hi, my name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you." Right, playing on the perception that we're going to sort of be predators or we're going to try to groom people, but he wants to recruit you to vote for me, right? And so there was a play on word there, which is also something the queers do well. The couple of other questions here that are somewhat related to what you've been talking about. So one is a question of, I'm going to ask these two together. One is a
Yeah.
question about, and people are thanking you for your amazing insights. I'm getting texts from people saying how great this is. So thank you for all of that. One person was wondering about the selection of the core values of a nation that you think will work in a campaign. And I was struck by that too. The idea of fairness works in Australia, equality worked in Ireland, freedom and love worked here. How do you come up with that? I'm curious on that too. Nuts and bolts question. Do you workshop these with small groups? Do you do other kinds of studies, that kind of thing? How do you come up with, how do you identify the core values that are going to work as frames? And then the second question relates to the polarization, which is it possible in today's day and age to campaign outside of social media now that platforms are co-opted and the algorithms work against us more likely than not? The first question on the values in the campaign comes from Malika, I think, Balkan, and then the second one comes from an anonymous attendee. So values framing and social media or no?
Okay, we'll do the social media one first. We should all campaign on every platform that's available to us, first of all. Just before I posit that at the beginning, if there's a platform we can use for something as important as our status and standing and our dignity, we should stand on it. We shouldn't leave any platform unexplored. You're right, it is not the world's greatest place, but that doesn't mean it is not without its value. And is not without some incredibly powerful way of connecting and setting your own tone as a campaign, because people are engaging with it. I always think it was such an asset for us trying to talk about how we wanted to create space. Did it get through to everyone, that message? No, because the algorithm doesn't work that way, but it gets through to a lot of people, and you can get in a way, this connects into how do you meet people where they are and core values. I mean, before we even talk about countries, you can have core values within a region. You can have core values within a faith. You can have core values within a sporting fan. So it's about how do you identify that? And of course, coming back to that in a second, you can use your platforms to really allow people to see that you're there with them. Like, we done a fabulous ad in Australia, which was two gay cowboys in Queensland, and they're ranchers. And of course, it was wonderful, no more than the priest who said vote yes, because it was a surprise. But it also connected with people from Queensland. It connected with rural communities. These weren't automatic places where people think we're going to do very well. And it's because we wanted people to see that we were there amongst them. And social media became this brilliant platform for us using that positive message of different types of visibility so people could see us as of them. So never give up on social media. What a phenomenal, powerful tool, but also, unfortunately, has all the capacity, unfortunately, to marginalize to hyper polarize conversation. So you have to really use it to try and break through that. That's a condensed answer for what could be an entire lecture about how we engage with social media and how we engage with media, and we'll probably do a lot of it in the other one's. I think the core value one's such an interesting one because there's so many ways to do that. Because we don't have to, like I say, you don't have to think about countries alone. Yes, you could use focus groups. Yes, you can use polling. Yes, there's loads of existing polling about most countries. But also, you could pay for your own research if you had a capacity for those things, or could that kind of resourcing. But if you take, for example, people of faith is a really good point of going, right, how did we get people to a certain point in this discussion? Because what we couldn't do was run a campaign. And unfortunately, we do this a lot, where we were asking people to make that choice, the non-blurred line from your previous question. You're either pick a side, gay or God. What a terrible choice to ask people. But we were doing that all the time in our campaigns, or implying it all the time, when in fact we could connect to people of faith by thinking about what are their core values. And of course, people of faith, including myself, have very clear core values because they've all been written down in books about what those core values are. So when we campaigned, in Ireland, we talked about, the dignity of human life, the dignity of the person and the individual, the importance of treating people as you would like to be treated. All these lines are core value lines of many faiths, but also very core value principles of why someone should vote for equality for someone who lives in their community. So again, using our language to find the common ground so that people could, even if they just got to the stage of going, okay, I don't see this as the enemy of me at the very least. Some people won't make the full journey to being a yes voter, and certainly very few of us do in one jump. So constantly in a polarized world, trying to find those common threads so that we're talking to people through a value framework they already have, and that they can see what we want. Like all people who are campaigning for inclusion, is all we want is in. So I know, again, these are condensed answers to that question about how we find it, because that could be a nation we're talking about either. It could be a county, it could be a rural people, it could be sports fans. Thinking about what are these common threads so that people can manage to vote yes. In a way, what we're asking them to do is they're going to vote yes or come on board, and they're going to see it as a way of affirming their own value set.
Yeah. I just wanted to, we're out of time, but I wanted to name some of the other questions just because I do think there are more questions than answers, and you've been very generous in answering a lot.
Sorry about that.
No. But I think there are a couple questions. I just want to name them because we don't have time to get into them, but I think they're important and they flow from this
Yeah.
conversation and all the wisdom you've shared with us. One person, Mariana Ruiz, says, that, don't you think that in countries where equal marriage has succeeded, such as Argentina and the other countries that you've worked in, is key to keeping the campaign, despite the legal win, right? To keep it going.
Totally.
And then
100%.
yeah, Melody Ninjuki says, how do we answer to the fears that society has on grooming and recruiting, like the age-old "we harm children," right? We're predators and freaks. Another question that comes from that comes from Lawrence Firi Chipili says, following the continuous killing of queer people of faith, how can African LGBTQI activists effectively engage with religious leaders and communities to challenge homophobic and transphobic attitudes? Another question about framing, right? That you mentioned that the identities, focusing on identities that are familiar with most people, but doesn't that have the effect potentially of on other identities in the larger community in the long term if we don't include them in our original messaging? For instance, the rise of the anti-gender and anti-trans rhetoric in the
Yeah.
West that's so powerful right now.
Cool.
And then
Yeah.
one last question. This is from Neil Thompson. Campaigning in a country like Nigeria is extremely challenging
Yes.
in creating spaces for non-confrontational dialogue. What advice can you give to activists in hostile countries to frame their campaigns and messaging that speaks to these hostilities and restrictions? And maybe if you could just say a final word on that, because these are questions that get at the root of the real challenges that you're talking about. Talking to faith leaders, right? Campaigning in countries like Nigeria here that are hostile in their own particular way, right, to this kind of work. What kind of final word might you offer those folks?
I think two things. One, I'm going to take all these questions and actually use them in the next series of talks,
Great.
because
That's kind of why I
each one of
named them.
these is a wonderful lecture or a wonderful discussion, not lecture, a wonderful discussion in itself. I think we shouldn't oversimplify. This is the point, and I think the questions about Nigeria and people from strongly religious backgrounds, as is the country I came from, which was in the middle of a religious conflict when I was growing up. So I mean, I think we can build great, strong campaigns, but that's why we have to build great, strong campaigns. These are hard questions, and they're hard campaigns. These aren't easy wins. And it doesn't mean that, these aren't long roads if we do this right. So, and I don't want to give people a flippant one-liner for any of those, because I think none of that would address what are incredibly important, interesting questions that I really am going to come back to people on. But this is why it's worth our strategy. It's simply not enough, and it's actually dangerous for simply to stand up and go, this is what we want, and think that announcing what we want is in some form, some way strategic. It's not. What matters is how do we get there? How do we build pathways for other people to get to us as well as us to get to them? Because we are the minority, and we have to work out in this really polarized world, how do we create all these spaces and journeys? These are tricky and they look different everywhere. And so and again, this is such a non-answer because that's such a broad theme. But I think when you're looking at faith, countries that are in different places of the journey that is in that question, and then that other really interesting piece about how do you bring everybody with you, which I think definitely there's a full lecture in. That's a hard one, because the minute you make choices in a campaign, the minute you may be actually getting to a point where people disagree with your choices, no matter what those choices are. Because the funny thing is, and I'm going to shut up. Sorry, Tim. Everything I've just said, I could be wrong about. Now, I've been part of two big referendum campaigns. I've been part of several political campaigns. And so far, what I'd like to think is some of this is really solid learning on it. It also mightn't work everywhere as well.
Yeah.
So we have to have a level of humility about this will look different everywhere, but what are the kind of principles that we can build around it that could help you, whether you find yourself in a deeply religious country, whether you find yourself in a country that's way further back on its journey towards treating LGBT people properly.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
condensed
Tiernan,
answers.
I want to thank you for this. This was So rich. And I appreciate your humility. I like your humor as well, of course. But I also appreciate the kind of nuances of the earned wisdom, the well-earned wisdom that you've offered up today. There are a lot here. I took a lot of notes, and I'm a professor who usually does not take notes. So I took a lot of notes. So bravo on that. I want to thank you for launching this masterclass with us on behalf of obviously the human rights diaspora of the Carr Center, and that's the audience we have today. Thank you so much. And then just to remind the folks who are here, who are part of our global LGBTQI plus human rights changemakers network. For those of you who are in that network, Changemakers Network, we would love for you to RSVP and to sign up for one of the or all of the for subsequent pieces of this masterclass, which began masterfully today. So Tiernan, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for engaging and collaborating with our program, for being part of our teaching faculty, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everyone.